at some point, I don't know when it was some point when I was in high school, pretty young, early years in high school. I remember going to my folks and I insisted to them that I felt, and I don't know if this is because of a literature teacher that I had, because of some friend's influence, I don't remember who it was, but I insisted to my parents that I needed to read absolutely everything that had been written by Dostoevsky. The famous Russian writer wrote Crime and Punishment and The Idiot and Brothers K. Like, I insisted, I just need to read this. And I remember when I said this to my parents, and I'm going to read everything that's been written by Dostoevsky, I remember this smirk kind of coming across my dad's face, and it was probably well-deserved. My dad was someone who'd read very, very widely throughout all of literature and fiction, and I know at that point he was probably thinking to himself, oh, Mr. Literary Fancy Pants here, because up to that point, I think I had spent most of my life reading Stephen King. That's a little bit of a jump to Dostoevsky from Stephen King. Stephen King's probably the literary equivalent of the Very Hungry Caterpillar, okay? And I was running to jump into these books that have all these Russian names that I can't even pronounce, let alone plot lines I could probably track with. But I insisted that for Christmas, I wanted anything and everything by Dostoevsky, and on Christmas morning, I remember what I got instead was a collection of short stories by Dostoevsky, and I have often thought back at that and thought my dad made the right call on that gift. Kind of prepped me and got me ready for some of the longer works and some of the more difficult and advanced works that had been written, but I've also been incredibly thankful because there's one particular short story in that collection that I've always loved. It's called White Nights, and it's this really powerful story. I'm not going to lie, it's a pretty depressing story, so if you go out and buy a collection of short stories by Dostoevsky and you read White Nights, just be forewarned, it's a pretty depressing story, honestly. But it's also a very powerful one to me because it tells the story of this guy. I don't think you ever learn his name. He's living in St. Petersburg, and he is like just profoundly lonely. I mean, he's got no family, he's got no friends, and one of the things that he does at night when he's walking home from work, and then even beyond, he'll even pass his home and just keep walking. He walks the streets of St. Petersburg in his loneliness at night, and it's just this powerful look of what it's like to feel like you're a stranger in a strange land, and you're just looking for someone to connect with. And there's this one part in the story, my guess is most people who read it probably just jump right past it and don't pay attention to it, but it's one that's always stuck with me. I think of it all the time, is that there's this one moment where you're several pages into this lonely existence for this guy, but he's walking down the street one night, and what's happened is, and I go through this because I kind of work in the same place each day, and I get to know some of the people in that area. I recognize them. So-and-so is probably coming in. It's about 10 o'clock. Well, that was the way for him. There was one guy who every single night he would pass by on the street, just every single night at the same time, same guy. And there's just this powerful moment that Dostoevsky writes about in which this guy, the protagonist of the story, is walking along, and here comes the guy at that same time, and the protagonist of the story says that there was this just a brief moment where it looked like the guy who was passing by. You know what it looks like when someone's about to say something to you and you're anticipating it, and you just think to yourself a conversation's about to unfold, and yet the guy doesn't do it. The guy actually, it's almost like he starts to, and then he pulls back and he just keeps walking. But for the guy in the story, Dostoevsky writes it so powerfully, is that it lifts him. Even if it wasn't even some profound greeting, it was some kind of greeting. There was almost some kind of breakthrough. And it says in that moment that the guy almost felt like his heart was going to explode out of his chest. And the guy hadn't even said anything to him, but just that one moment, like just the hope of that one moment, that very simple greeting of a guy almost opening his mouth to say something, and even still saying nothing, that it just unlocked this guy in the story. And it just moved him deeply, and it gave him hope. And it was the kind of thing for him in which he sat back and he thought, you know, if I can have more of that, then maybe it makes walking these strange streets just a little bit easier. You know, that St. Petersburg can become home for him. I would sum it up this way, that this is what Dostoevsky, I think, gets at even in that moment, even though it's not the whole purpose of the story, is that there is such immense power in a simple greeting to give rise to the human heart, like to make someone think it's going to be okay, to make someone know that they've got a person, and maybe even a people, because sometimes when you get greeted by a person, you think to yourself that they might be, and we've used this language before, a gatekeeper to a whole people that you can connect with, that maybe you've not just got a person, but you've got a whole people even with whom you can walk these strange streets. Thought about that so often. I've thought about that story again by Dostoevsky when I come to what's our next one another passage. You know, we've been going through the series that I've called Life Together, in which we've been looking at each of these one another passages in the New Testament. There's something like close to 60 of them. Some of that's repetition. We've talked about teaching one another, admonishing one another, showing hospitality to one another. Here's one for us. Romans 16, verse 16. I'll start there because we were in Romans last week. This is at the very close of those two chapters we looked at. Greet one another, Paul says. 1 Corinthians 16:20 says it again, greet one another. Also, in a second letter that he writes to the church in Corinth, in chapter 13, verse 12, greet one another. In Philippians chapter 4, verse 21, a letter that we explored last fall, greet all the saints in Christ. It's a fascinating one another. It's funny that when I go through all the one another's in Scripture, and I try to determine which ones do I want to cover, because there's something close to 60 of them. Which ones do I want to dig into? Do I dig into the ones that often get repeated? Well, this is one of them that pops out to me. Greet one another is said again and again by Paul. In fact, I think it's more than even just those 4 times, really, because if you count some of the other commands, some of the other one another's that Paul talks about that kind of use the same language of greeting someone, welcoming someone, showing hospitality to someone, then I think Paul says this a lot. This might be the one another he says the most out of all of them. And it's not just Paul. Peter gets in on the action. John gets in on the action. Greet one another, greet one another, greet one another, greet all the saints in Christ. It's repeated again and again by Paul, and you think to yourself, there's got to be some kind of story behind that. Something that drives Paul to repeat that so often. And what I've come to really by way of a conclusion is that I think the reason why Paul has to repeat this so much, and it is maybe the most repeated one another in all of the New Testament, is because of the relational tendencies of the church. And maybe that's not even the best way to start. Maybe what you start out with is saying it's because of the structural tendencies of the church that give birth to certain relational tendencies. That was true in the early church. If I were to describe to you or grab in a picture what the early church looked like, it looked like this: circles of people. You know, I mean, last week we were celebrating the day of Pentecost, right? That's why we had that really wonderful picnic afterwards. It seems like on the day in which we celebrate the birth of the church, we should probably have some kind of celebration. So we all headed over to Swinford, had a lot of fun over there. It was a beautiful afternoon, but that was the day of Pentecost, a celebration of the birth of the church. And when you read about the birth of the church in Acts chapter 2, what you see is you really do see thousands of people coming together. Now, some people say, well, that was the birth of the first megachurch, which doesn't really make sense at all because they were all coming from different countries, okay? Thousands of people coming together from different countries and then going back and probably shaping and forming churches over there. But what I do find fascinating is that we've already covered this in another sermon. Acts chapter 2 tells us that after thousands of people come together to form what could be seen as the larger church, that immediately what happens is they bind together in smaller circles. Remember we covered these verses, and there were added that day, the day of Pentecost, about 3,000 souls, and they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to the fellowship, to these smaller and tighter forms of community and relationship, to the breaking of bread, having a meal together, and within that context, communion together, and to prayer for one another. And all who believed, they were together, and they had all things in common. And day by day, attending, yes, the temple together and some of these larger gatherings, but also breaking bread in their homes. And so that's why I say when I have a picture in mind, kind of a word image for what the early church looks like, yeah, that maybe the whole slide represents what the church looks like as a whole. But within the church are these circles of people who are coming together and binding themselves together for the kinds of things we've been talking about the last few weeks: the teaching of one another, the admonishing of one another, the batting away at some of the issues that they face in their lives. And it's a church, and it's beautiful, and it's wonderful. And quite frankly, that's not just the image I would present for the church coming out of Pentecost, but that was the image for the church all throughout the New Testament. Everywhere we read about a new church, or historians find different documented kind of evidence of what the early church was up to, it was people who met in people's homes. I mean, they didn't have even a school building they could rent or something along those lines. That was much later when they had these huge houses of worship. At best, maybe they had some kind of temple in their town, but for the most part, they were house churches, people who gathered home, smaller circles of people in which they were doing life together and doing some of the messiness and the nitty-grittiness of what we've been talking about. And it's beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful. And yet at the same time, the problem that you face is that all the while what we read in Scripture is all these extra individuals are making their way to the church, aren't they? All these people, I mean, you read about this in the book of Acts, that there were so many people that even though they kind of lived in fear of the church because of the power of the church and the influence of the church, some of the stunning things that they heard were going on in the church, it still says, yet at the same time, God was wooing people like crazy and drawing them toward the church. And so all of these individuals are making their way there. And the thing is I think, and you know what this is like when you're going somewhere new, and you've believed and you hold there to be some kind of belief. I don't know if they all believed in God right away, but they believed him enough to want to draw near and to come into these people and to try and figure out, can you teach me? Can you admonish me? Can you shape me? Can you form me? But you know what it's like when it's new. I think it had to have been true that they came trembling as they came thinking, is there going to be a place for me? Do they have time for me? Are they even going to see me? Because the truth is, they had to have heard the rumors that, quite frankly, I mean, well, they know all of the people who are involved in the church are human beings, which means their lives are probably just as much of a mess as their lives are, and they're probably pretty busy trying to iron out all the wrinkles in their spiritual lives. Are they even going to have time for me? Are they even going to notice me if I come into their midst? Will they see me? Will these circles break apart? Because what's going to happen if the church isn't careful is that we will be so intertwined with one another in the doing of life together that these people will come and they're just going to bump up against these circles. I found myself this week also thinking about an article I read a long time ago by a guy by the name of Andy Stanley. Some of you may have heard of Andy Stanley, ministers down in Atlanta. Huge church. And one of his sayings, which he's talking about small group life in the church, he said, man, circles are better than rows. And what he gets at in that is, of course, in rows, as we're all sitting here, you're staring forward, you're listening to one person talk and this, that, and you can kind of shuffle out and make your way home. And there's really not a whole lot of intimacy about rows. And so what Andy Stanley says is in these smaller circles are better than rows because that's where life can happen. But one of the things, and I tweeted this out yesterday, is one of the things I struggle with is that's absolutely true. Circles are better than rows, but are the circles going to get unbroken? Because the truth is, on a lot of Sunday mornings, and I think it was true for the early church, it's a lot easier to slip into a row. At least you have a way in. But a circle, I mean, what do we talk about a circle? It's unending. It never ends. Always connecting. The breakthrough point seems impossible with the tightness of these circles. And so if the church isn't careful, they're just going to, no way in. No way in. And I think that is often the structural tendency in the early church, and it gave birth to a relational tendency in their church in which they were doing life together. I've used this phrase so many times, Reunion, and I know I've used it ad nauseum, but it is so important for us. That's the idea that we have to be careful of the danger of doing life together at the expense of doing life with others. And what happens with the early church is there is something profoundly beautiful about what we read in Acts chapter 2, 41 through 47, and that togetherness and that life together. But they had grown so busy with it that they don't even know when people are coming and trying to just break through. New believers, newer believers, new to them believers. Which is why I think Paul comes along and has to say again and again and again in his letters, okay, but don't forget. Greet one another. Greet all the saints. Greet whoever comes through your doors and is coming toward you. You greet them. Because it's grown even more impossible when you read Paul's letters. Listen, we talked about this last week. The reason I led with Romans chapter 16, verse 16, when Paul has to say to the folks in Rome, make sure you are greeting one another. Why is he having to say that to them? It's for the very reasons we talked about last week, is that there's these tight circles of these Jewish believers, and they're busy taking care of one another, and along come Gentile believers who are trying to break into the circles, but they just can't break through. And Paul deals with all kinds of traditional and cultural cultural junk and garbage that they've got to deal with. But what's funny is he distills it all down to this very simple command in the book of Romans. We're going to be okay if you all just start greeting one another. Because the heartbeat all through Romans is Paul trying to desperately say, God is wooing a family of believers together, and don't you dare stand in the way of that by the tight-knittedness of your circles. And it all starts with the very simple power of a greeting. So make sure you're greeting one another. Make sure you're greeting one another. Make sure you're greeting one another. Philippians 4:21, keep greeting all the saints in Christ. It's Paul trying to say to every church as it's starting to grow and the circles of beauty form, I get it. You're busy in those circles, what with all the teaching and the admonishing and the working to live in harmony and the loving of one another. I mean, I just wrote you a whole letter about ways to go even deeper in all this. But this final thing I say to you, other believers come to you now, so you go to them. You break loose and you greet them as they come. And maybe, just maybe, they'll enter the circle, or at the very least feel like you're letting them in the circle. So what I thought of this week is that greeting one another, and really it's the very first simple step toward loving one another and really doing all of the one another's. My simple greeting to you is my saying this to you, isn't it? It's a very simple message I give to you. I see you. I see you. And I hear what you are saying by being here in our midst, that in some way, some shape, some form, you believe and you are seeking to maybe belong. So friend, how can I be here for you? We never talk about the power of just the simplicity of greeting someone, but there is immense power. Can I come back to what I said at the beginning? There's immense power in a simple greeting to give rise to a human heart. For just one moment, when someone comes to us trembling, I see you. And it's going to be okay, and we can walk these strange streets together. Now, this is my confession to all of you this morning. I mean, and I offer this because, quite frankly, I think it can be your confession too. And I think this is an epidemic thing all over the place. Is that when I walk into this place on a Sunday morning and I know that I've got some space before the worship service begins and I've got some space after the worship service is over, if I am not careful, this is my confession, if I am not really careful, that what I will do is I will scan the crowd of the people who are gathering in those moments, and I will make my way to the person who promises me the least amount of awkwardness. Now, that's putting really crassly and really bluntly, but I also am putting it very transparently, and I will say it very boldly, because you do the same thing. That when we come into these moments, what happens is we scan the crowd and we figure out who promises me the least amount of awkwardness right now by way of conversation. Who's the person that I know? And what happens for us, because we make such a strong push for smaller community interaction, and maybe some of you have made these really wonderful blossoming friendships within your house churches, that when you come together, that's what you think to yourself is, I know them, and I know what they're going through, and I need to check in with them, and I need to stoke the fires of that relationship. And so that's who we go to, isn't it? We know the entry points with these people. We know that there won't be a lag in the conversation, or we know if there's a lag in the conversation, it's not going to be profoundly awkward because we're pretty comfortable around each other. That's what you do, and that's what I do. That is what the average American churchgoer does. Is that we go into settings like this and we are constantly trying to identify who are my usuals. Who can I sit by? Who can I be with so that I can just ride out the time until the band hits the first note, and then when the band hits the last note, I go right back to talking to them because this could be a profoundly awkward experience for me. Isn't that how we operate? Is that what happens for us as reunion? It's the same thing. I'm putting 5 circles up there because we got 5 house churches that have formed. And what happens is this could be who we are within a larger spectrum of who the church is. And the thing is, people are coming our way, and they are coming our way trembling, and they are troubled by whether or not we are going to once again pay attention to them. Is there a place for me? Do they have time for me? Do they even see me? And if we're not careful, we can send them away simply by our not breaking away, by not doing some simple, small thing that says the circles can be broken and they will be broken for you. And so I think to myself, what does this mean for us? Well, Reunion, I get it. You're busy in those circles, what with all the teaching, admonishing, working to live in harmony, the loving of one another. But Paul, to us, again and again, other believers come to you now. So you go to them and you greet them as they come. And maybe, just maybe, they'll enter the circle. So can we talk about this for just a moment, what this looks like very practically? I told you yesterday on Facebook that I was going to keep this very simple today. That's mostly because last week I got so thoroughly lost in my own sermon, I thought we should probably go simple today. I want to start simply by this. Can we all embrace the fact that it does not matter whether or not you are on the welcome team? You are a greeter because you are a Christian. This is something Sarah and I found ourselves talking about a lot this last week. There's a lot of things about today's church that I find really fascinating, and I define to be really telling. And this is something I find really fascinating about today's church. This is everywhere. It's something I find really telling. We actually have to have welcome teams. Isn't that fascinating? We actually have to go to people and assign to them, can you make sure you say hi to someone? Guys, that's messed up. Honestly. We're having to form welcome teams. Isn't this astonishing? And the thing is, Sarah brought this up, which I think this is really great too, is that when you go to a store, there are people who are paid at stores to say hi because we're so bad at it. We so thoroughly don't care about people we don't know that we're paying people salaries to say hi. This is amazing. And it's amazing, especially within the church, in which God is bringing together people where we are unified under who Jesus is and the joy of what he's done for us, and we actually have to come together and say, okay, now we should probably have someone at every door because all the rest of the people aren't going to say hi. I mean, it's awful, isn't it? But you go to any church in America, so-and-so's in charge of our welcome team. We've got a welcome team, and I think our welcome team does a great job, but sometimes I sit back and I say, this is really weird that we have to have a welcome team. Because you're all on it. It's the same thing as sitting there going, so-and-so is really good at evangelism, so I'm going to sit this one out. No, I'm sorry. You're a Christian. You have to talk about the things that God has done. You have to. You're called to. Greet one another is an actual commandment. It doesn't matter if you're not on the welcome team. You are a greeter. So let's embrace that. And so let's go a little bit further here, and this is probably where I'll start to get in trouble. Can we start getting here a little earlier? I mean, can we start getting here just a little, like actually aim to get here a little earlier so that there's actual space here? And here's why I'm bringing this up. Here's why I'm bringing this up. Because I have had people who have explained to me afterwards that they arrive at service early because they think probably people are getting here around 9:45. Now, the case is, what they don't know is that's not so with you all at Reunion. Like, we're just latecomers. We are. And yet what's really difficult is most people who are visiting for the first time, guess what? They're going to arrive here a little bit early. Not everyone. I'm not saying everyone, but a lot of people come here early. I've had people who've gotten here and said, is there a service here? And then what happens, and this is so sad to me, some of them will actually go out and wait in their car until they start seeing people arrive. And I'm going to tell you something, I want that to stop. I don't want it to stop now. I mean, I love you, but like the same thing is for me, like there's a lot of times where I love being right on time for something. I don't like to be there a whole lot early. The problem is I don't really care about that for you all. I care about that for the people who are coming early. I mean, can we figure out how to come here early and actually make use of the space that we have before services, and then stay a little longer to make use of the space we have after services, so that we can have a moment where, yeah, we could even still have some time to connect within the circles that means so much to us, but that we're breaking away and no one has to feel incredibly awkward when they get here and we're all showing up at 4 till, you know? And this is, I'm not slapping your hand. I guess kind of am. I'll give you a hug afterwards. But like, we really need to grow in this. We really do. We really do. Because one of the things I hear is we are a welcoming people when they get to know us, when we show up on time and have some time with them. The truth of the matter is, the reason I'm bringing this all up is because I love you all a whole lot of stinking much. Because you're nice and you're fun and you're funny. And I want people to experience that. So come here early. That was my way to save it so you don't feel I'm a jerk. Here's the other thing I would ask you to do. Resolve not to talk first to the usuals, the folks in your circle. Resolve to talk first to those who are new, who are newer, or who are new to you. Again, I walk in, I think to myself, who can I talk to right now that promises me the least amount of awkwardness? What I want you to do is actually embrace the fact of who can I talk to that might very well promise me the most amount of awkwardness. Because right now they're just dying. They're coming here and they're wanting to be a part of this to some degree. So what can happen is when you scan the crowd is who is absolutely new to me, or who seems kind of new around here, who at least is new to me. You know, I've had a lot of people say, I don't know if I want to go up and talk to someone because I think they've probably been coming for 4 weeks and I should probably know their name by now. Maybe you should. So go know their name. Get it. Go meet them. And be so bold as to say, you know what, I should probably know your name by now, but I don't. My name is so-and-so. What's your name? Because chances are, if you don't know their name, they don't know your name, so you're all awkward in the same boat. Resolve not to talk first to the usuals, the folks in your circle. Resolve to talk first to those who are new, newer, or new to you. And when you talk to them, by all means, keep it light and keep it tight. But I would also say keep it meaningful. Now here's where we take a little bit of an awkward turn, because one of the things I held back from this, because everyone thinks it's really weird, is that in almost all the commandments that Paul gives in which he says greet one another, he follows it up by saying greet one another with a holy kiss. And I confess all the time, I don't really know what to do with that. Because if we greet someone with a holy kiss, they will greet us with a restraining order, and it will get awkward. No one does that. Well, I shouldn't say that. That's not an American thing. If you go to Europe, it's going to happen. You're going to, oh, we're going all in. All right. But here, it's a little different. And so sometimes I try to think to myself, what does that look like? A lot of people just say, well, that's just, it's a hearty handshake. It might be. But I don't necessarily think a hearty handshake is really all that intimate. Quite frankly, the language that Paul uses is some way of intimacy. It's a real strong statement of we are in this. Like, I really do see you. Aren't you saying something? If you give someone a kiss, you see them, okay? And I've thought about what that means so much, and it's one of these things that, a lot of times when we welcome someone, what ends up happening is we'll just say to them, welcome to Reunion Church. It's great to have you here today. And something that's kind of gone through my mind, I've thought about this a lot, is Frederick Buechner is one of my all-time favorite writers, and he has this really powerful quote. He says, when I tell you my name, I have given you a hold over me that you didn't have before. Like from that point on, if you call out, I will probably stop and look and listen whether I want to or not. And I thought about just the simplicity of someone who's coming to us, who is nameless to us, and we are nameless to them. I wonder if, at least in our culture, could very well be this. That the intimacy, that the kiss that we grant them is simply that we give them our name, because that's an incredible gift. It is. Because what happens for someone, and you've been in this before, where you found yourself in a nameless crowd and you just meet someone, like maybe you've gone to a conference and you know absolutely no one, but you meet someone at lunch and there's some guy and his name is Harold, and for the rest of the conference you're like, I don't know anyone here, but I know Harold. Like, how much would it be for us to just simply say, it's really awesome. My name is Brian. That what happens is you're given the gift of, I'm going to at least be some kind of anchor for you. I'm going to be some name for you. I'm going to be some person, humanized soul for you right now. Maybe that's what it is. You give them your name. And then afterwards, what I would say is contact me or Emily to see if we've got contact info for those that you meet, and you send them a follow-up note. Sometimes, by all means, Emily and I will contact people who've come through and they've visited, they've filled out a card or something like that. But if you think we might have contact information for this person, ask us for it so you can send a note. Because if you've given your name, it might really mean a lot for them to actually get something from the person they've met and they're getting to know. And then what I would say is do it all again the following Sunday and the Sunday after that. And extend the greeting just a little more each time, and do it all again the Sunday after that, and maybe sit with them during service, and then do it all again the Sunday after that, and maybe break bread with them afterwards, have lunch with them afterwards. I know how many people have said to me sometimes when it comes to greeting and regularly coming back to people, seeing how they're doing every week by week, is someone will say, I don't want to do that because I don't even know if I would want someone to do that for me. It's like when I go to a store and I sit there and someone comes up and says, do you need any help? Do you need any help? Do you need any help? Drives me nuts. Well, here's the thing. We're not talking about a store here. We're not talking about this idea of just trying to, do you need help knowing where the bathroom is? I mean, this is profoundly different than that. It's about relationships. If people are coming to us, then what they're wanting to do is to experience who God is and to experience who we are in light of who God is. And so, quite frankly, I'd rather be a little bit obsessive about just how much we're reading out to them, because when they come through that door, they are saying, this is what I want. Now, I don't know if that's totally what they want or if they know that's what they want, but that's what they're saying. They've been wooed somehow by the Spirit, so we tap into that vein. And quite frankly, I've been to a lot of churches where they said, let's hold back with guests and let's not talk to them a whole lot because they probably want to be a little bit anonymous. And all I'm thinking to myself is, that's a stinking bait and switch. That's what that is. Because everything that we say about what it means to be a part of the church it's about relationships. It really is about us boldly having the moment in which we invade one another's lives for the sake of growing in who God wants us to be. I would rather go ahead and have them say, man, they check in on me a lot, rather than sometime come later and say, oh, now you all of a sudden care. Do you see what I'm saying? So I would just not worry about that at all. And trust me, if someone really doesn't like it, they will let you know. They will. I've had that happen. And so at the end of this, you did it, you greeter, you. Congratulations. You've made a stranger out of a usual, or a usual out of a stranger, so now what you need to do is ditch them and go greet someone else. It's one of these things in this whole series that I was doing on the one another's, is I thought to myself, what do I do with this one? Because there came a moment in which I thought to myself, we should do probably this one another of greet one another. Do I do it at the very beginning? Do I do it at the very end? I decided not to do it at the very beginning because, quite frankly, I thought the very first thing we needed to talk about was loving one another. Because if we can't commit to that, I don't even want us greeting one another. Because I think greeting, once again, is the first step of saying that we're going to love one another. But at the same time, I thought to myself, I don't want to greet one another at the very end. And I thought maybe I want to do this in series because that's almost like a nice end of the series of, okay, and now go out and do it for more people. But at the same time, I didn't want to put it at the very end because I don't want us thinking, okay, now that we've done all the wonderful, beautiful work of community life together, now we can get around to greeting some more believers in on what we have. That's awful. And so the more I thought about it, the more I'm like, why don't we put this kind of right in the middle of the series? Because what I think Paul is getting at is this is the kind of thing you just keep doing again and again as a regular rhythm of all the other stuff that you're doing. This isn't something that happens at the beginning. It's not something that happens at the end. It's the thing that's happened at the very beginning, middle, and end. A lot of people ask me, how on earth are we going to continue to grow? And I don't know all the answers to that question, but I know one very simple answer is this. Maybe we just start by greeting one another. We'll see how God waters that and makes it grow. Let's pray.